Hi, and welcome to INSSA Insights with Amaury Cooper. We are looking forward to a great episode today with Liz Cathcart, Executive Director of Hostage US. Liz, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. First off, why don't you tell us a little bit about Hostage US?
Yeah, I'd love to. So Hostage US is an NGO. We're set up to support families of Americans taken hostage or wrongfully detained abroad, and then support the hostages themselves once they're released. So that looks like a variety of different services throughout the hostage taking and on the reintegration phase. Um, I'd love to tell you a little bit about sort of the genesis of the organization, get into why we are established,
Please.
where we're at now. Awesome. So in 2015, it was following the murders of four Americans at the hand of ISIS in Syria. And obviously now that's a pretty relevant topic as we're watching what's going on in Syria. And in 2014, four Americans were very brutally murdered by ISIS. And what happened with the Obama administration at the time was that they recognized that these situations, the hostage takings themselves and also the aftermath of the murders were handled just incredibly poorly.
Mm.
The families were not treated well. The government was not coordinated in their efforts to get the people home. There was a lot of gaps that needed to be addressed, in particular in the strategies of the U.S. government in responding to these cases. And so in 2015, Obama ordered a policy review of hostage activities throughout government. And one of the gaps that was seen was this support side. So the independent source of support for families who are thrown into what is just an absolute whirlwind of trauma, of information, and figuring out how to get their loved one home. And so Hostage US was born out of that need, which was recognized actually by our counterparts in Britain years before that. So there's a sister organization previously called Hostage UK, now called Hostage International, that was established in 2004 by a guy called Terry Waite, who was held in Beirut. And so once Hostage US was established, we started getting cases of family members who were going through hostage cases of a loved one being held or wrongfully detained. And from the get-go, we recognized that this independent NGO support was incredibly necessary. Mm-hmm. The government has the mandate to get the people home, but there wasn't a focus on how to make sure that in these long-term cases, the families actually cope through the situation. And when the people return home, when the hostages return home, how they actually get back on their feet.
The reintegration aspect, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
What are so can you expand on how does Hostage US work with families and returnees?
Yeah, definitely. So when somebody's taken, and oftentimes, we're introduced by. Oftentimes it's an organization. So a lot of times these cases do involve, NGO or faith-based workers or journalists, these types of people, and their organization will actually introduce us to families, or the government will, or they'll find us, by good old-fashioned Google search. Mm. And we're introduced typically fairly early on in these cases. And what we do is we provide them with, think of it as a bit of a social worker. So we have volunteers, professionally trained volunteers who work directly with families. And so we assign based on the family's situation, their preferences, what type of support person they're looking for. We assign one of our 16 support volunteers to that family member. And initially, it's a lot of just getting to know each other. Our team will start to understand what challenges that the family is facing, and give a lot of advice on what they might face, right? So let me break it down for you in sort of the bucket areas that we really focus on. The first, and probably most important, is the emotional support side of things, right? Just making sure that that family knows that they have somebody to talk to who's on their side, who, can be a confidential source of support. And the confidentiality within the organization is, again, of the utmost importance. And we really do have that as one of our core values, to make sure that nothing that's said between family members, between us, is ever, talked about publicly. These cases are incredibly sensitive. And so to have that value is really important. And so we start with that emotional relationship building. And once we kind of establish where the family is at in terms of, their mental health, their emotional health, we start to talk about other practical issues. So one bucket is financial challenges. And so I want you to kind of imagine if, you or one of your family members was just plucked off the face of the earth and put in a cell or held by a terrorist group, not able to talk to you, to tell you how to manage your financial affairs. Those things become complicated really quickly. So oftentimes people who are taken have rents to pay. They have, bills that are being auto debited from their account. They have mortgages to pay. Whatever it might be, the family has to initially start considering, what does that look like for the potential long term, right? Because we're talking, a lot of the cases that hostage U.S. supports are years and years. Our average duration is about 2.5 years.
Wow.
And so it goes a lot higher than that, and it does go shorter than that, of course. But on average, we see these cases last about that long. And so getting the financial pieces and helping families to get the financial pieces in order early on can be really, really helpful for the long term. And sometimes that involves us, just as an organization, reaching out to banks or the IRS on behalf of families and saying, there's no checkbox for my family member is taken and I need to access their accounts, but we've established ourselves as an organization that is a support to families, and so we're able to use sort of that name and that reputation to ask private companies to make special considerations for families. So the financial aspect is really important. It's honestly one of the most stressful, because everything changes when somebody is no longer here, no longer able to take care of their finances. And so that kind of bleeds into also the legal challenges. So I know with a lot of NGOs that I talk to, the making sure that employees' paperwork is up to date, so that the legal next of kin, if you have an employee taken, that type of thing. Well, for families, it kind of goes a step further, where if they don't have a power of attorney in place, for example, they're not able to access assets of the loved one, or even shared assets, right? So if you have a shared family home with your spouse who's taken, and it's gone on for 3 years, and you're in a financially tight spot where you want to be able to either sell the house or take out a second mortgage or whatever it may be, you might not be able to do that because both of you aren't home to okay that process. And so we have 4 law firms who offer pro bono support for families for issues like that. Power of attorney is a big one. I think most families will have challenges around that. But it's also the odds and ends. It's things like child support. If you owe child support and you're taken, and you don't have an income or something coming back in, your family's not able to cover the child support, then you're in a really bad spot when you come home. And so we have these law firms who are able to help families navigate some of these really tricky things that you just wouldn't think about. And then
a lot of the partners are a lot of the partners that you work with. You mentioned these 4 law firms that do it pro bono. I hope that a lot of the other organizations that you work with to do this also do pro bono, or is that fee based?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Everything we do and everything that we do through partners is free of charge for families. I mean, you couldn't even begin to, I still can't imagine how much families pay on these cases, because they have to come to DC every so often to, meet with government officials. They have to oftentimes send money to prisons for the wrongful detainee to actually buy, life supplies, things like this. They have to pay lawyers. So very expensive crime for the families. Really, really puts them in a bind as well. And so, yeah, all these practical challenges we just kind of try to hit, head on. We try to be proactive with the families to make sure that they understand what type of obstacles they might face, so that later down the line, they're not facing even more complicated obstacles because of not addressing them early on.
Yeah. Can you give us some statistics on hostages? I know that you're limited sort of as far as scope to the United States, but from a U.S. perspective, then, and I can only imagine that number, if you go outside the United States, is even larger. But could you give us some statistics on hostage and wrongful detainees?
Yeah, definitely. And I think for a second, it makes sense to give you a little bit of definitions here as I give you sort of the statistics as well. So the three types of hostage taking that we deal with are kidnap for ransom hostage taking, which tends to happen in places like Mexico, Latin America, and others as well, but that's where we see it most frequently, tend to be short, oftentimes more violent, because the kidnappers want to resolve the case and they want money. And that's as simple as it gets, right? It's an exchange of money. The kidnappers don't want to hold the person any longer than the person wants to be held, so it tends to be resolved fairly quickly. Those are more frequent, certainly, than the other two that I'll mention in a second, and but again, tend to be quicker change of hands. The other hostage cases that we manage or that we support on are the terrorist hostage cases that tend to be politically motivated or ideologically motivated, and the resolution tends to be a lot more complicated. Sometimes there's a demand for money, but that money number is pretty astronomical, right? It's not going to be an amount that a family is typically capable of raising or paying for. So the resolution takes a very long time, and these groups have very specific reasons for taking Americans and using them as pawns. In a similar vein, then we deal with state hostage taking, which is wrongful detention, where a state actor will arrest an American on trumped up charges, typically espionage, but could be a minor infraction that then they put a massively long sentence on, a person and start negotiating with the government pretty quickly. And so those are pretty obvious in terms of, appearing to be just trumped up charges. And so those cases, wrongful detainees tend to be a lot longer and resolved diplomatically. So with those three types, Hostage US has some data on it. It's really difficult to get very clear data because the government manages many of these cases, especially the hostage and wrongful detainee cases. But the KFR cases, kidnap for ransom cases, are oftentimes resolved quickly enough within, especially if it's a employee of an organization, and they might just be able to pay and have it be resolved. But we estimate there's about 200 Americans held each year of those three groups. Right now, there's publicly 34 Americans who are held hostage by a terrorist group or wrongfully detained. So those are long-term cases, 34. And that number fluctuates, right? So a day before Thanksgiving, there were 3 Americans who were released from China. And in August, there were 3 Americans who were released from Russia. So that's already 6 that we got home fairly recently, which is fantastic. And so, the breakdown of the kidnap for ransom cases tends to be a pretty big mix of people, but I would say the hostage and the terrorist hostage and wrongful detainee cases do tend to be, folks and NGO workers who work in particularly challenging areas, faith-based workers who do the same, and also journalists who, of course, need to be in these areas for work that they do. So it's pretty challenging.
And do these skew towards male or female or young, old, or is it really just just depends on the situation?
Totally depends on the situation. Yeah, really, really dependent. We saw in Haiti, for example, 17 Americans kind of ran the gamut of demographics there on the question that you just asked. So, yeah, just totally depends.
Okay. What can you mentioned NGO workers. Our primary listening demographic are NGO security managers. What can they do? What can NGOs do in general to help prepare not only their staff but prepare internally for potential wrongful detentions or hostage taking?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think first and foremost, I just want to say that I understand that the operations must go on, right? Like that's the basis that we're working with. It's not a just because a country is, known to wrongfully detain Americans. I understand that that doesn't necessarily change operations. So to your point, it's not always an answer of, don't go to that country, right? So how do you realistically prepare when your work is in an area that these issues actually happen, and we're seeing it more frequently? So there's a couple of things that I would definitely encourage, from my side, I'm on the support side of things rather than the response side. So I'll highlight the what we can do for our people to prepare in terms of the support. And first is, when you are recognizing a country that you're operating in as a potential risk zone for hostage taking or wrongful detention, is just absolutely making sure that all of the employee paperwork is in place. So what I'm talking about specifically is kind of what I've already mentioned, actually, but making sure you know exactly who the next of kin is, and that's updated. It's not, the next of kin when I was hired 10 years ago. It's who is my next of kin now, right? Because there's probably a lot of stuff that happened in my personal life in the past amount of time. So that is just really basic, really important. I honestly encourage if the location is particularly risky, I really do encourage employers to consider talking to their employees about power of attorney. It's a challenging topic, obviously, because that is really facing the issue head on. But I cannot tell you how valuable having a power of attorney is if, somebody is taken. It is life-changing for the family. We've gone through retroactive power of attorneys with families. It takes years. And yes, they're getting pro bono, legal support from our partner law firms, but I mean, it's just something that no one wants to go through. And had they had that from the get-go, their lives would have been so much easier, and a lot of more energy could have been spent on fighting the good fight rather than fighting to just have access to assets. So power of attorney could definitely be a consideration, and you can always have limited power of attorneys as well. So there's no reason why someone couldn't, put a power of attorney into place that literally says if I am, taken hostage, wrongfully detained, you can get that specific on them. And then another area that we see as challenging and could be a really easy fix is the Privacy Act waiver form. So when someone is detained, it is really challenging for the government to share any information about their well-being, about their situation, about anything, unless they have the Privacy Act waiver signed. And so it goes so far that the State Department actually can't share with congressional members, so senators and representatives, about the state of the hostage or wrongful detainee unless that Privacy Act waiver is signed. And oftentimes with wrongful detention cases, Congresspeople can be very, very helpful in the resolution. And so when that information can't be shared, it's really problematic for the family, for the hostage themselves, that type of thing. So I'd encourage employers to look into that and see if that's something that they might consider, having people sign beforehand. I mean, I certainly would want to if I was traveling into one of these areas, just to make sure that my family could manage a little bit easier. And then the other side of it is just thinking about in-house what you have either already or what you could grow in terms of a support structure. So We do training actually on if an employee is taken hostage, how the best practices and your duty of care in support for those people. But I think a lot of NGOs have structures already in place that can be replicated for these crimes. It's a challenge because these crimes are so long term, right? Like we're talking years and years and years, and typically security managers are managing crises that happen, and there's a start and an end that happen fairly quickly and don't go on that long. So it is valuable to do at least conversations, if not, tabletop exercises on actually how could our NGO support a family for so long, realistically? Because it also comes down to salary. Like
Sure.
if your person is taken, will you continue paying salary for that long? Is it possible? Right? I mean, I know as well as everyone listening who works in an NGO, right? Resources are limited. It's a really challenging discussion, but I think having a plan that you of course can deviate from, but having a plan in place and buy-in from leadership about how far you can go as an organization is really, really valuable in the planning stage.
You mentioned trainings that Hostage US does. Could you elaborate a little bit on those trainings and yeah, just give us some examples of some of the things you mentioned some already, but what other types of trainings? I believe I remember, and I think actually one of my colleagues actually went through your hand-holding course. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So we have a training that can be virtual or in person, and it really focuses on the first of all duty of care of organizations in these crises. Right, the challenge is that if a family is not feeling well supported, or employee when they get home is not well supported in the reintegration phase, more likely than not, we will see a lawsuit following that. We've seen quite a few in the past even year of when people have come home. And so just understanding your duty of care and your responsibilities in these types of crises is obviously important, but then how do you act on that, right? So we talk a lot about the duty of care, and then we talk about best practices. So what does family support look like in the long term? How can, again, going back to the limited resources, how can your organization liaise with the family appropriately, but also continue what you need to be doing and make sure that that is balanced in supporting and being there for the family, but continuing on operations. And so the training covers what families experience during these cases, the elements of family support for the long term. We dive into sort of different topics that could be relevant. So, and it's kind of tailored to each organization. So it's very much different for each group that I talk to, but it could be focused on media and how could that play out in these cases, positive and negatives. Also managing, children's responses to these types of things, if there's children within the family, managing challenging moments. So, proof of life videos, calls from hostage takers, releases. And then, of course, on the flip side, we get to talk about the a bit happier stuff, which is the reintegration of that person into work. And how do you do that in a way that meets them where they are? But again, meets your needs as an organization, because being realistic, we do need to talk about both sides. So we kind of cover all areas of that family support and experience, and making sure that the people who I'm talking to are leaving with an idea of how they can use their current structures to do this type of support, but also if there's any gaps in what they have available through their either employee assistance programs or other family liaison programs that they have for crises.
And with the hand-holding course specifically, what isn't? And I say that because I think oftentimes security managers are they either lead or are certainly members of the crisis management team, and they often might be called in to go to speak with the families. So what does the hand-holding course entail?
Yeah, I mean, so we talk about that initial moment, right? So we talk about who should be in in the room, or hopefully not, but potentially on the call for that initial conversation between the crisis management team and the family themselves. We do a little bit of exercises around that because that is honestly, as you know, as probably many people listening know, first impressions are everything, especially when it's coming from your an employer. So you want to make sure that you get that right and set up expectations in a way that is realistic for both sides as well. So we talk a lot about that initial contact. We talk about communications plans moving forward. Because again, just it being such a long-term case, it's so unique in terms of how you communicate with the family. We talk about the benefit of having a consistent family liaison officer and what that actually looks like, to your point of kind of hand-holding the family and making sure that that contact is consistent, but also knowledgeable. So they have to be sort of read in enough within the case to be able to support the family. So we talk about how that works, within the context of the organization I'm talking to, but also where I've seen that work really well, where I've seen that sort of break down and how to sort of come back from that type thing.
Yeah.
And then sort of what the trade-off looks like in the movement from, working with the family, supporting the family, and then suddenly the person's home, and then trading off to working with the employee themselves and getting them back in, and what that sort of transition looks like.
I've been to your website numerous times, and I know that there's a lot of resources available there. But what resources are available on your website, as well as external resources that you can recommend?
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate you looking at that. I love to hear that it's been useful, and we have longer guides on. 4 guides on coping through kidnapping, return to work from a employee perspective, and return to work from a organization perspective, and then handling the media, which just tends to be such a massive, massive topic in and of itself. And so those guides are the sort of longer, more in-depth ones, and then we have one-pagers on sort of everything that you could imagine that families go through. So the idea with Hostage US is. And our mission, of course, is to support families and returnees, but that doesn't always mean that structure that I mentioned at the beginning, which is, walking with them. Sometimes families need one-off help on this issue or that, and that's what they need and want, and we meet them there. And so our website, we really wanted our website to be the top resource database of these issues and what families might face throughout having a loved one taken. So we have sort of one-pagers on various topics. But beyond that, I'll mention the 2 government resources that certainly everyone listening should be aware of, and that is the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs office, which is in the State Department, and they manage wrongful detention cases. And that is just a name, an office that everybody should be aware of, because they're incredibly skilled at doing these, obviously diplomatic resolutions, but also even if you're in a bit of a spot where you're not really sure what's going on, someone's been arrested and it feels not right to you, that type of thing, they can be a resource in helping you kind of think through, or at least give you answers on who to approach, that type of thing. And then on the terrorist hostage cases, that's the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell, which is at the FBI. And both offices are, incredibly well staffed and also very, very helpful to employers facing these types of issues. So those resources are very, very valuable.
Great. As a tip, what is the first number that someone should call, U.S. organization or whoever, if they believe that their loved one or their employee has been taken hostage or wrongfully detained?
Yeah, not me, but they should definitely, on the wrongful detention case, right? So they should definitely call the embassy in country first and foremost. Like that should absolutely be the first call. And consular affairs will work through making sure that the visits happen to the prison and all that good stuff. If again, if it is to you as an employer pretty obvious, trumped up charges, this type of thing. Obviously SPIHA is your sort of next step, but consular affairs through the embassy is absolutely first call. On the terrorist side, FBI through and through. So you can call your local FBI, agent, and I'd encourage everyone listening, if you don't already know, if you don't have a relationship with your local FBI field office, just try to make that, because it is valuable to have those relationships built. But you can call the field office directly, and what they would do is then immediately call the hostage recovery fusion cell, assuming it's a terrorist case, and get you well connected with them, and it happens very, very quickly. And the notification from the FBI field office to here in DC would happen quickly, but then also the notification from, assuming it actually is a terrorist, hostage taking, the notification from the fusion cell to the family would also happen quite quickly. So, organizations would be sort of read into that and make sure that they're able to also communicate with the family and make sure that they let the family know that they're here and supporting them as well.
Yeah. What are there any books that sort of describe? I believe I read one. I think it's On a Rope and a Prayer or something of that nature. But that sort of describes both the hostage and the family, or wrongfully detainee and the family sort of dynamics and how that works out. Any resources that on the book side?
Yeah, definitely. And Rope and a Prayer is a great one. It like you said, it goes chapter by chapter from the family member side to the hostage side, and that just shows such a well-rounded view of how both are reacting sort of in the moment as the hostage case goes on. I have, I know this is a podcast, but I am sitting in front of quite a few books that are related to hostages. But there's two that I'll mention, and one is Desert and the Sea, is written by Mike Scott Moore, who was held by Somali pirates, and he's on my board, but he a journalist who was held for 977 days by Somali pirates. In 2012, and was rescued, thankfully, and or actually he was his mom paid ransom actually for him, but really fascinating story. And actually, the Somali pirates who took him were sentenced about 2 weeks ago, I want to say, in a New York court. For their crimes, which is also a fascinating thing about these cases, is that especially on the terrorist side, the FBI does not forget, and they do seek justice for these people, which is wonderful. And then the other one, and that was a hostage taking, and so I'll also recommend another one, which is called Prisoner, and that is by Jason Rezaian, who was held in Iran for 544 days, and you'll have to fact check me on those lengths, but he was detained by the Iranian government on charges that were completely trumped up and false. He was the Washington Post Tehran bureau chief, reporting reporting for the Post, and was picked up. And so both of those stories kind of show the hostage cases, by the Somali pirates, and then the state hostage taking by Iran. And I think those are really good view into both crimes.
Well, last but not least, I always ask our guests what they're reading. Not necessarily related to, it doesn't have to be related to your work. Hopefully it's not. Hopefully it's a little bit more uplifting. Any books that you recommend for our listeners?
Yeah, I'm reading an interesting one right now. It's called, it's totally different. It's called Tom Lake. It's just kind of a fun read, written recently, just about a mother and three daughters and kind of sharing their life story. It's lighter than, I have to say, what I typically read, which is nice. Sometimes I go through phases of reading, hostage books, but sometimes I do need a little bit of a break from that.
I can imagine. Well, Liz Cathcart, Executive Director of Hostage US. You can get more resources at hostageus.org. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to the Robert McPherson Fellowship for its generous support and donation helping to make these podcasts possible.